ears off. 1953 to 1959, Loretto, Kentucky. Bill Samuels grew up around bourbon, though he did not particularly like the dark brown, corn-based spirit that had been distilled in Kentucky since before American independence. The Samuels family had been making bourbon commercially since at least the mid-1800s, perhaps even further back to when much of Kentucky was the far western frontier of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Samuel's great-grandfather, T.W. Samuels, started an eponymous distillery in Deatsville, 40 miles south of Louisville, in 1844. The ownership structure changed in the 20th century, including before and after Prohibition, in the 1920s and early 1930s, although it always involved the Samuels clan, which lived on Whiskey Road in nearby Bardstown. Neighbors included James Beauregard Beam, whose nickname and surname would grace perhaps the world's most famous bourbon label. The brown-haired, slimly built Bill Samuels, then just 26, took over management of the distillery in 1936 after his father died. Amid this change, one thing held constant: the iffy quality and therefore taste of T.W. Samuels whiskey, which through its corn-heavy recipe was technically from the bourbon branch of the stylistic spirit tree. "That shit will blow your ears off." That was the assessment of Marge Samuels, Bill's wife, of bourbon in general in the 1950s. Distilled primarily from corn, bourbon distillers also typically added rye, a coarse grain that gave it a rougher mouthfeel, and barley, used primarily to spur fermentation. Its enzymes broke down the grain starches into sugars, which yeast could then convert into ethanol. The smell and taste of that alcohol was also front and center for most bourbon, condemning it to be the sort of firewater one knocked back quickly, and with a chaser of beer, water, or something else coldly soothing, rather than sipped genteelly for the texture and aroma. Bill Samuels himself had a physical aversion to spiciness. He never ate Mexican food, for one thing, and he found drinking bourbon, even his family's, a chore rather than a delight, something akin to a waking nightmare for a resident of Kentucky, which produced nearly all of the world's bourbon, and which very likely gave the spirit its name through its Bourbon County, which was once much bigger than its present-day borders. The state's signature beverage was often described as a back-of-the-mouth drink best swallowed fast for a rollicking buzz, not a front-of-the-mouth one for a tippler to roll around the tongue and savor. One reason for this perception was the rye-reliant tradition. Another was the larger bourbon industry itself, abetted by the federal government. American bourbon makers staggering out of Prohibition in 1933 faced stiff competition from foreign imports, particularly whiskeys from Ireland, Scotland, and Canada. The former two had never dealt with a widespread alcohol ban, and Canada's experiment with Prohibition ended long before that of the United States. To hurry up and compete, bourbon makers released wares that had not been sufficiently aged. Bourbon usually spent at least a few years in new oak barrels, which had been charred on the inside first, before bottling. The resultant releases tasted terrible to seasoned bourbon drinkers, and they saddled the brownest of the brown whiskeys in America with a reputation as swill, according to one observer. Nothing in the rules, though, prevented distilleries from spilling this swill onto the market. Federal benchmarks dictated that a whiskey could call itself bourbon if at least 51% of its grain bill was corn, it was aged in previously unused oak barrels that had been charred on the inside, and it entered the aging barrel at a certain alcohol strength or proof and was bottled at a certain proof as well. These were not exactly exacting regulations, and some distillers took advantage to produce oceans of so-so product as more and more lighter whiskeys and blends flooded the market. World War II placed the industry at a further disadvantage. The Federal War Production Board took over the distilling industry nationwide and swung it from making ethyl alcohol-based beverages such as bourbon to industrial alcohol. Materials such as grains and glass became scarcer too, as the fight against fascism